Welcome back to One Boring Historian, where history doesn't have to be confusing, just boringly accurate. Before we dive in, let's make this fun. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, what time it is for you, and tell me your favorite period of history. I'll be going through the comments, so let us see if we've got any midnight historians, early bird scholars, or fellow medieval fans out there. And of course, if you love long deep dives into history, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's get boring in the best way. Welcome to the Middle Ages. When people hear medieval, most picture armored knights on horseback, castles rising against the horizon, or peasants tilling muddy fields. Hollywood paints it as either a world of noble kings or a nightmare of dungeons and disease. But the reality, much more complicated. The Middle Ages span 1,000 years, from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance around 1500. That's nearly a millennium of human struggle, survival, faith, and transformation. A time when Europe reshaped itself from scattered kingdoms and tribes into the foundations of the modern world. For most, daily life was not about kings and crusades. It was about surviving winter, raising families, working the land, and clinging to faith in times of famine or plague. The story of the Middle Ages isn't just about battles and crowns. It's about the countless ordinary men, women, and children who lived, labored, and died in this long era. In this journey, we'll step into their shoes. We'll see what they ate, how they loved, what they feared, and how they found joy in a world that often seemed so alien to us. And by the end, we'll see that the Middle Ages weren't so much dark as they were deeply human. To understand life in the Middle Ages, we need to understand the system that defined it, feudalism. At its heart, feudalism was a hierarchy, a pyramid of power, loyalty, and obligation. At the very top sat the king, but kings in this period were often weak compared to the vast lords who ruled their own lands. Below them were nobles and barons, who pledged loyalty to the king in exchange for land. Beneath the nobles were the knights, warriors who swore loyalty to their lords, offering military service in return for protection or small estates. And at the very bottom, the largest class of all, the peasants and serfs. They farmed the land, gave crops to their lord, and in return received protection from invaders, bandits, or rival lords. But here's the truth. Feudalism was never one neat system, perfectly organized. It was messy, inconsistent, and constantly shifting. Loyalties could be bought, land could change hands, and wars often tore apart these fragile agreements. For the peasant, however, none of that mattered much. Their lives were bound to the village, their lord, and the land they tilled. Most never traveled more than a few miles from home in their lifetime. In many ways, the feudal world was less about castles and crowns, and more about an unspoken agreement. You work, we protect. If you were an ordinary person in the Middle Ages, odds are you lived in a village. Villages were small clusters of wooden homes, usually thatched with straw. Smoke from cooking fires filled the air. Livestock wandered through muddy lanes, and the church steeple often rose at the center, the heart of both spiritual and social life. Houses were simple, 1 or 2 rooms, dirt floors, no chimneys. Families cooked over open hearths, with smoke drifting up through holes in the roof. Furniture was sparse, perhaps a wooden table, benches, and straw mattresses shared by the whole family. Life revolved round the agricultural calendar. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer was weeding and tending crops. Autumn was harvest, and winter was survival. Most peasants sowed their lord labor, working his fields a certain number of days each week, while also farming their own small plots. Community was everything. Neighbors relied on each other for tools, labor, and support. Festivals, marriages, and church services were shared experiences. The village was your whole world, and though it may seem harsh to us, for many medieval people, it was the only life they knew, one of routine, faith, and survival. For most people in the Middle Ages, work was the rhythm of life. From dawn to dusk, the peasant's world was defined by the fields. The day began with the rooster's crow. Men, women, and children alike headed out to tend crops, herd animals, or mend tools. Agriculture was backbreaking and primitive by today's standards. Wooden plows pulled by oxen, hand scythes for harvesting, and sheer muscle power for nearly everything. The year itself was a cycle of labor. In spring, fields were plowed and sown with wheat, barley, oats, or rye. Summer brought haymaking and the endless task of weeding and guarding crops. Autumn was harvest, the most vital season, when a year's survival depended on what you brought in. Winter, by contrast, was quieter but harsh, with repairs, spinning wool, and tending to livestock indoors. Peasants owed their lord a share of their labor. A few days a week, they worked his land, not their own. They also paid taxes in crops or livestock. Life was demanding, but there was a sense of rhythm and necessity. Everyone, even children as young as 7, had their role in the economy of survival. To be idle was dangerous, even sinful. Work was not just survival. It was seen as a duty to God and community. What did medieval people actually eat? The answer depended heavily on your social class. For peasants, the diet was simple, repetitive, and heavy on grains. The staple was pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, beans, oats, sometimes flavored with a scrap of meat if you were lucky. Bread, often dark and coarse, was eaten with nearly every meal. Cheese and ale provided calories, while water was often unsafe to drink. For the nobility, the table looked very different. Lords and ladies dined on roasted meats, game birds, and fish, often spiced with exotic seasonings imported from the East. Banquets showcased wealth. Peacocks served whole, pies filled with songbirds, sugar sculptures as centerpieces. Yet even nobles had their limits. There was no chocolate, no potatoes, no tomatoes, no coffee. All of these came later from the Americas. A medieval feast might seem lavish, but it lacked many of the foods we consider essential today. Seasonal scarcity was real. A bad harvest meant hunger, sometimes famine. For peasants, meals were rarely about indulgence. They were about surviving until the next season. Clothing in the Middle Ages wasn't just about keeping warm. It was about showing who you were. For peasants, clothing was simple and practical. Woolen tunics, linen shirts, cloaks for warmth, leather shoes if you could afford them. Colors were earthy, browns, grays, muted greens. Clothes were patched and reused until they fell apart. The nobility, by contrast, flaunted wealth through fabric and color. Silk, velvet, and for signal status. Dyes in bright blues, deep reds, and rich purples were costly, reserved for those who could afford them. Laws called sumptuary laws even restricted certain fabrics and colors to the elite, ensuring peasants remained visibly separate from nobles. Fashion also shifted with the centuries. Early medieval nobles wore flowing robes and cloaks. By the late Middle Ages, men sported fitted tunics and hose, while women's gowns became elaborate with long trailing sleeves. Headwear, from peasant hoods to noble hennons, those tall cone hats with veils, told a silent story about class and fashion. For everyone, clothing was labor-intensive. Spinning, weaving, and sewing consumed endless hours. A single wool tunic represented months of work. Clothing was not fast fashion. It was survival, identity, and status all stitched together. What was it like to grow up in the Middle Ages? Childhood existed, but it was short. Infant mortality was high. Many children did not survive past age 5. Those who did quickly entered the world of work. By 7, peasant children were expected to help in the fields, herd animals, or learn trades. Childhood as a time of play was brief and often blended with responsibility. Yet, children did play. Archaeologists have found toy knights, dolls, hobby horses, and carved dice. Festivals and fairs offered moments of joy. Songs, riddles, and storytelling passed through generations. Education varied sharply by class. Noble boys might be trained for knighthood, learning reading, Latin prayers, and horsemanship. Noble girls were taught household management and embroidery. For most peasant children, formal schooling was rare, though village priests sometimes taught basic prayers or letters. Despite hardships, families loved their children. Records show grief at their deaths, pride in their marriages, and efforts to provide apprenticeships or dowries. Childhood may have been short, but it was not absent of affection. In medieval society, family was everything, both a source of labor and a unit of survival. Marriages were rarely about love. Among nobles, they were political tools, forging alliances and securing property. Among peasants, they were practical, ensuring enough hands to work the land and continue the family line. Weddings were community affairs, often held at the church and followed by feasts. Consent was important in theory. The church required both bride and groom to agree. But in practice, parents often arranged unions, especially for daughters. Women's roles revolved around household management, childbearing, and helping in the fields or workshops. Men provided legal authority, but women were not powerless. Widows could run businesses, manage property, and sometimes wield significant influence. Families were large, though high mortality meant many children did not survive to adulthood. Grandparents often lived under the same roof, and the extended household was vital for work and security. Love did exist, but it was often expressed through care, survival, and shared struggle more than romantic poetry. If there was one constant in medieval life, it was the struggle against sickness. The average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, though that number is misleading. Many died in childhood. Those who survived early years could live into their 50s or 60s. Still, illness was ever present. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. Physicians often based their practices on the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, doctors might prescribe bloodletting with leeches, purging, or balancing diet. Herbs were used widely. Garlic for infections, willow bark for pain, sage for digestion. Hospitals, run by monasteries, were more about spiritual healing than medical recovery. The focus was on prayer, charity, and comfort rather than cures. Surgery was performed by barber surgeons. Men who cut hair, pulled teeth, and occasionally amputated limbs, with no anesthesia. Procedures were brutal. Superstition blended with medicine. Amulets, charms, and prayers were believed to ward off illness. Astrology, too, was used. Doctors sometimes consulted the stars before prescribing treatment. Despite the limitations, people did what they could. The sick relied on family, faith, and folk remedies. Survival was uncertain, but resilience was constant. Nothing shaped medieval life more than the church. from birth to death. It guided daily existence. At baptism, infants were welcomed into the Christian community every week. Villagers attended Mass, listening to sermons in Latin even if they didn't understand the words. Confession, marriage, and burial were all bound to the Church. The Church was not just a spiritual authority. It was also a political and economic force. Bishops and abbots controlled vast lands. The Pope wielded power that could rival kings. Monasteries collected tithes, a tenth of one's income, making the Church one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe. For ordinary people, faith provided structure and hope. The fear of sin and the promise of heaven gave meaning to hardship. Saints' days punctuated the year with festivals, processions, and holy feasts. Yet, the Church was not beyond criticism. Corruption, indulgences, and power struggles simmered beneath the surface. But for the medieval villager, questioning the Church was rare. It was the glue that held society together. Monasteries were the beating heart of medieval spirituality and knowledge. Monks lived according to strict rules, such as the rule of Saint Benedict. Their days followed a rhythm of prayer, work, and study. They rose before dawn, chanted psalms, copied manuscripts, and tended fields or animals. Silence was often enforced, creating an atmosphere of discipline and devotion. Monasteries were also centers of learning. In a world where most people were illiterate, monks preserved ancient texts, copied the Bible by hand, and kept chronicles of history. Without them, much of classical knowledge might have vanished. They contributed to society. 2. Monasteries brewed beer, provided hospitality to travelers, and ran hospitals. Many innovations in farming and architecture came from monastic communities. Yet life was not easy. Poverty, obedience, and chastity defined monastic vows. Discipline could be harsh, and temptation was never far away. But for many, becoming a monk was seen as the highest form of devotion, a chance to live closer to God. For medieval Christians, faith wasn't only lived in the village church. Many dreamed of going on a pilgrimage, a journey to a holy site believed to bring blessings or forgiveness of sins. Pilgrims traveled to places like Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or Rome itself. The ultimate journey, of course, was to Jerusalem, though after the Crusades, this became dangerous and costly. Relics were central to pilgrimage culture. A fragment of the true cross, the bones of a saint, or even a saint's clothing was believed to carry spiritual power. Churches that held relics drew pilgrims from across Europe, and with them wealth. Pilgrimages were not only religious experiences. They were social events. Travelers formed groups for safety, shared stories, and exchanged news. Inns, shrines, and markets flourished along pilgrimage routes. For the pilgrim, the journey was both physical and spiritual. Every step was a prayer, every hardship an offering to God. To complete a pilgrimage was seen as a profound act of devotion. Faith dominated life. But so did superstition. Medieval people saw the world as filled with unseen forces. Witches, demons, and spirits were thought to lurk in the shadows. Amulets, charms, and spells were used to ward off evil. A simple iron horseshoe above a door was believed to keep away bad luck. Astrology held immense influence. The alignment of stars was thought to shape health, destiny. Even politics. Kings consulted astrologers before making decisions, while peasants checked the stars to predict harvests. Everyday life was steeped in belief. A sneeze might be seen as an evil spirit leaving the body. A black cat crossing your path was ominous. Thunderstorms were considered signs of divine anger. The church often condemned superstition, yet many practices blurred the line between official faith and folk belief. People might pray to a saint while also carrying a charm against illness. It was not either or, it was both. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in a world where the sacred and the supernatural constantly overlapped. Not everyone lived in rural villages. By the High Middle Ages, towns and cities were springing up across Europe, buzzing with trade, craft, and opportunity. A medieval town was noisy, crowded, and alive with smells both enticing and foul. Streets were narrow and often unpaved, lined with timber houses that leaned precariously toward one another. Waste sometimes flowed into open ditches, while vendors shouted their goods from stalls. Towns were economic engines. Merchants traded goods from far-off lands, silks, spices, furs. Guilds of craftsmen controlled trades, bakers, blacksmiths, weavers. Cobblers, each guild set rules for quality, prices, and apprenticeships. To belong to a guild was to have security and status. Markets were the heart of town life. Weekly fairs drew not just locals but travelers from neighboring regions. They were places of business, gossip, and spectacle. Minstrels performed, jugglers entertained, and merchants haggled over cloth or grain for many peasants. Towns offered freedom. A famous saying went, "Town air makes you free." Serfs who escaped to a town and lived there a year and a day without being caught could claim their freedom. But life in towns was not easy. Fires were frequent, disease spread quickly, and poverty was common, still, for those who dreamed of more than the plough. Towns held promise. The medieval castle is one of history's most enduring symbols. To the common peasant, it was both a fortress of protection and a reminder of their lord's dominance. Early castles were wooden motte and bailey structures, perched on raised earth mounds. By the 12th century, they evolved into stone fortresses, towering walls, drawbridges, moats, and keeps. Inside, life was not as glamorous as fairy tales suggest. Drafty halls, smoky kitchens, and cold chambers made castle living uncomfortable. Servants bustled about, cooking meals, maintaining fires, and caring for livestock kept within the walls. For nobles, however, the castle was a seat of power. The great hall served as both dining room and courtroom. Feasts displayed wealth with roasted meats, musicians and entertainers, tapestries, warm stone walls, and displayed heraldry. Noble families managed estates, administered justice, and prepared for war. Women often oversaw households, while men trained for combat or managed politics. Children of nobility learned courtly manners, literacy, and horsemanship. Castles were not just homes, they were military strongholds, symbols of feudal authority, and the center of noble life. Few figures capture the imagination like the medieval knight. But the reality was more complex than shining armor and noble quests. Training began in boyhood. A noble boy, sent away at age 7, first served as a page, learning courtesy, riding, and basic arms. By adolescence, he became a squire, training under a knight, caring for his armor, and practicing swordplay. If he proved himself, he was dubbed a knight, often in a religious ceremony. Knights swore oaths of loyalty to their lords, bound to defend their lands and uphold chivalry, a code emphasizing loyalty, honor, and protection of the weak. Yet reality often fell short. Knights could be brutal, raiding villages or fighting for profit. Tournaments offered both training and spectacle. Jousts and melees drew crowds, where knights competed for glory, prizes, or the favor of ladies. Armor evolved from chainmail to full plate, heavy but incredibly protective. Despite the romance of Arthurian legends, knights were not always paragons of virtue. They were warriors in a violent age, sometimes noble, sometimes ruthless, but always central to the medieval imagination. The Middle Ages were marked by near constant conflict, Warfare ranged from small raids between lords to massive battles between kingdoms. Armies were a mix of professional knights, mercenaries, and peasant levies forced into service. Siege warfare was common. Castles and fortified towns could resist armies for months. Attackers used siege towers, catapults, and battering rams. Defenders poured boiling oil. Dropped stones or fired arrows from battlements. Hunger, disease, and attrition often decided outcomes more than combat itself. Weapons advanced over centuries. The English longbow proved devastating at battles like Agincourt, piercing armor at great distances. Crossbows, though slower, packed deadly power. By the late Middle Ages, gunpowder appeared, changing warfare forever for civilians. War was devastating. Armies pillaged villages, crops were burned, and famine often followed. For the knight, battle was glory. For the peasant, it was destruction. Despite dangers, the Middle Ages were not static. People traveled for trade, for faith, for survival. Roads were poor, bandits prowled, and travel was slow. Yet merchants journeyed far, carrying goods along routes that linked Europe to the Middle East and Asia. The Silk Road brought luxury goods like silk and spices. Seaports thrived, sending ships across the Mediterranean and, eventually, to the Baltic through the Hanseatic League. Travelers needed inns or monasteries for shelter. Pilgrims moved along well-trodden routes, and minstrels wandered from town to town. Even peasants sometimes traveled to nearby fairs or markets. Trade enriched Europe. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa became wealthy from commerce. Towns along rivers flourished. The flow of goods also brought new ideas and, tragically, diseases like the plague. Travel in the Middle Ages was risky, but it connected people, cultures, and economies in ways that slowly knit Europe into a more connected world. Medieval justice was often harsh and unforgettable. For minor offenses like petty theft or public drunkenness, punishments were meant to humiliate. The guilty might be placed in the stocks or pillory, locked in wooden frames in the town square, exposed to jeers, rotten vegetables, and even stones from neighbors. More serious crimes brought brutal sentences. Thieves might lose a hand. Forgers could be branded. Accused witches, heretics, or traitors risked execution by hanging, beheading, or burning at the stake. Trials could be strange. Trial by ordeal was seen as God's judgment. A suspect might plunge their hand into boiling water or carry a hot iron. If the wound healed cleanly, they were declared innocent. Dueling was sometimes used as a way to prove one's case, with the belief that God would favor the rightful party. Justice varied by class. A noble might pay a fine for crimes that would see a peasant hanged. Yet law was not entirely arbitrary. Kings and lords established courts, and by the High Middle Ages, more formal legal systems began to emerge. Still, justice in the Middle Ages was less about fairness and more about order, fear, and deterrence. Few events shook medieval Europe like the Black Death, arriving in the mid-14th century. The plague swept through Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 of the population. It came from fleas on rats, carried by ships trading across the Mediterranean. Once it reached the towns, it spread like wildfire. Victims developed painful swellings, cold buboes, blackened skin, fever, and delirium. Death often came within days. Fear gripped communities. Families abandoned the sick. Entire villages were left deserted. The impact was catastrophic. With so many dead, labor was scarce. Fields lay fallow. Famine and economic collapse followed. The church struggled to explain the disaster, and some turned to flagellants. Groups who whipped themselves in public to atone for humanity as sins. Others scapegoated. Minorities leading to violent persecutions. Yet, out of devastation came change. Surviving peasants found their labor in high demand. Wages rose, the rigid feudal order began to crack. The plague, in a sense, reshaped Europe. For those who lived through it, the memory of the Black Death haunted generations. It was the darkest shadow of the Middle Ages, if plague was the greatest killer. Famine was its constant companion. The medieval economy depended on agriculture. A single bad harvest could spell disaster. In 1315 to 1317, the Great Famine struck Europe. Cold, wet weather ruined crops, livestock died, and people starved in some places. Reports tell of desperate measures, even cannibalism. Famine meant not just hunger but vulnerability. Malnourished populations fell victim to disease. Poverty deepened. Families sold possessions or themselves into servitude just to survive. Natural disasters added to hardship. Fires consumed towns built of timber. Floods destroyed crops. Winters could be long and merciless, with little fuel for heat for the medieval peasant. Life was a constant gamble against forces beyond their control. Survival was not guaranteed. It was earned, season by season. War was never far away for the noble. It meant duty, honor, and perhaps glory. But for the common people, it was terror. Armies marching through the countryside took what they needed: food, livestock, even people. Villages were burned, crops destroyed. Civilians suffered more than soldiers during the 100 Years' War between England and France. Raids devastated entire regions. Peasants fled to forests or fortified towns, abandoning homes. In some cases, they fought back. Uprisings like the French Jacquerie in 1358 erupted from frustration and despair. Women bore much of the burden. With men away at war, they managed households, farms, and children, while enduring the constant risk of violence for the ordinary medieval person. War was not banners and trumpets. It was hunger, fear, and survival amidst chaos. While much of medieval life was struggle, its art and architecture left a stunning legacy. Cathedrals rose across Europe, built with soaring stone vaults and dazzling stained glass. Gothic architecture transformed skylines with pointed arches, flying buttresses, and towering spires to medieval people. These buildings were not just places of worship. They were glimpses of heaven made real. Art flourished in illuminated manuscripts, where monks painted vibrant images in gold and jeweled tones. Sculpture adorned cathedrals with saints, demons, and mythical creatures. Tapestries hung in noble halls, both decoration and installation. Much of this art was deeply religious, but not all. Marginalia in manuscripts sometimes featured playful doodles, strange beasts, or humorous caricatures, showing that even in solemn works, humor found its way. Medieval art was not about realism. It was about symbolism, meaning, devotion, and centuries later. Its beauty still commands. Medieval life was not all toil and fear. People sought joy, music, and play. Music filled both church and tavern. Gregorian chants echoed in monasteries, while minstrels and troubadours sang tales of love, chivalry, and adventure in town squares. Instruments like lutes, harps, flutes, and drums accompanied dancing at festivals. Entertainment came in many forms, traveling jesters, puppet shows, and morality plays acted out biblical stories. At fairs, acrobats, jugglers, and fire-eaters thrilled audiences. Games like dice, chess, and backgammon were popular. Even peasants played ball games or wrestled in fields. Festivals punctuated the year. Harvest feasts, May-Day dances, and Christmas revelries brought moments of communal joy. Life was hard, but celebration was essential. Though most people were illiterate, the Middle Ages were not an age of ignorance. The Church preserved learning. Monasteries copied classical works of Aristotle, Plato, and Galen. Cathedral schools trained clergy in Latin and theology. By the 12th century, the first universities emerged: Bologna, Paris, Oxford. Here, scholars debated philosophy, medicine, and law. Knowledge also flowed from the Islamic world, where scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic and advanced fields like mathematics, astronomy, and medicine through trade and conquest. This knowledge reached Europe, sparking intellectual revival for nobles. Education meant training in letters, rhetoric, and sometimes poetry. For peasants, it was rare, though parish priests sometimes taught basic prayers or letters. Still, the seeds of wider learning were planted in this era, laying the foundation for the Renaissance. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Middle Ages were shifting. The Black Death weakened feudal structures. Towns and trade grew in importance. Banking families like the Medici rose to power, signaling the dawn of a new economic age. The Church faced crises. The Great Schism divided papal authority, and reform movements challenged corruption. Meanwhile, the 100 Years' War reshaped politics, and gunpowder weapons began to eclipse knights on horseback. In Italy, art and learning stirred. The rediscovery of classical knowledge and new artistic techniques birthed the Renaissance. The Middle Ages, after 1,000 years, were giving way to a new world. The Middle Ages left a legacy still felt today. Feudalism faded, but its echoes remain in land laws and traditions. The Church's influence shaped Western thought for centuries. Universities founded in the Middle Ages still stand as centers of learning. Architecture, literature, and music from this era continue to inspire. The ideas of law, chivalry, and community born then still resonate in culture today. Even myths of knights, castles, and quests fill our imagination, long after the last knight rode into battle. The Middle Ages were not truly dark. They were complex, dynamic, and deeply human. And so, after 1,000 years, the Middle Ages ended. But for those who lived it, peasants in smoky cottages, monks in candlelit scriptoria, knights charging across battlefields, it was simply life. We often look back with a sense of distance, but the truth is, medieval people loved, worked, suffered, and celebrated just as we do. Their challenges were different, but their humanity was the same. The Middle Ages remind us that history is not only about kings and wars. It is about the countless, ordinary lives that built the world we live in. If medieval life was measured in hunger and harvests, it was also measured in holy days. The year unfolded as a rhythm of fasts and feasts, processions and pageants, with the church bell as metronome. For many communities, a third of the year could be touched by some kind of observance, some solemn, some raucous, most deeply communal. Advent to Twelfth Night. In winter, Advent quieted the countryside with fasting and expectation. Then Christmas burst in with midnight mass, carols, and the rare indulgence of meat and spice ale. Children received small gifts of nuts and dried fruit. Mamas wandered door to door in costume. The season closed with Twelfth Night, when roles might briefly invert. A lord of misrule presided over games, and servants ribbed their masters with impunity before normality returned. Lent and Easter. Lent curtailed diets, no meat, often no dairy or eggs, and emphasized almsgiving. Markets answered with fish and all. Cooks improvised with almond milk and pea porridge. Holy Week brought processions and passion plays. Easter Sunday lifted the fast in a rush of bells, white garments, and feasting. Egg symbols of new life reappeared in kitchens and games. Spring and summer revels. May Day crowned a queen of flowers, raised the maypole, and spun the village into dancing. Regation days walked the parish-bound's prayers for good crops punctuated by ale and gossip. Mid summerlit hilltop bonfires, leaping flames were said to guard against misfortune, while herbs cut that night were thought to gain special potency. Harvest Thanksgiving. No feast mattered more than harvest. A successful reaping meant survival. Villagers decorated the last sheaf a harvest queen or corn dolly, and brought it in with song. Barns echoed with fiddles, rough ballads, and the clatter of trenches. Ill flowed, but also relief. Accounts from manor courts show fines relaxed and disputes postponed through harvest time, saints, fez, and market holidays. Patron saints' days mapped identity to place. St. Cuthbert in the north, St. Denis in Paris, St. James at Compostela. Pilgrim badges pinned to cloaks turned streets into slow-moving rivers of devotion. Chartered fairs St. Bartholomew's in London. The champagne fairs were commerce wrapped in carnival. Cloth and spices beside jugglers, tooth drawers and relic sellers licensed disorder. Despite periodic condemnations, communities cherished ritual misrule. The Feast of Fools let choirboys parody their superiors. Boy bishops processed in borrowed mitres. Parish plays teased hypocrisy as much as they taught doctrine. Periodically bishops tried to suppress excess. Periodically people brought it back. These holidays were not escapism. They were social glue. In a world of scarcity, they created cycles of anticipation and release, turned neighbors into fellow celebrants, and reframed survival as shared thanksgiving. Medieval women's lives were varied, indispensable, and under-recorded. The law and the pen tilted toward men, yet women's labor and authority underpinned household, market, and manor. Peasant women. Before dawn they stoked hearths, baked bread, fetched water, milked animals, spun wool, and joined men in the fields. Manor rolls list women mowing, weeding, gleaning, and binding sheaves. Spinning and brewing often a woman's trade turned raw materials into clothing and cowries. Childbearing was risk-laden. Godparent networks and midwives formed protective circles round mothers and infants. Urban women. In towns, women ran stalls, sold fish or vegetables, stitched garments, and crucially brewed ale. Alewives appear frequently in civic records, praised when ale was wholesome, fined when measures ran short. Many guilds admitted women as members or partners, particularly in textiles, brewing, and food trades. Widows, inheriting tools and contexts, often kept workshops alive. Noble women. Marriage was diplomacy, but within great houses women managed estates, accounts, rents, disputes, provisions, servants. While husbands mustered for war, wives collected arrears, negotiated with tenants, and sometimes directed defense. Chroniclers admired and bristled at such authority. Black Agnes. Agnes Randolph famously held Dunbar Castle in 1338, taunting besiegers by dusting damage from the battlements after bombardments. Religious women. Convents were islands of education. Nuns taught girls, nursed the sick, and copied books. Some corresponded with princes. Hildegard of Bingen composed music and wrote theology. Visions and advice. Christine de Pizan in the early 1400s argued for women as virtue and capability in a male-dominated literary world. Female mystics Julian of Norwich among them wrote reflections that still resonate. Law, property, and voice. Women's legal identity was constrained under coverture, yet customs varied. In parts of Europe, daughters inherited in the absence of sons. Town charters sometimes protected wives' shop goods from husbands' debts. Widowhood often brought real leverage, control of dowries, authority over apprentices, choice to remarry or not. The archives seldom spotlight women, but their fingerprints are everywhere, in ledgers balanced, cloth measured, fields harvested, and letters sent. Without them, the medieval economy and family doesn't function. The medieval economy needed a choreography of specialists, some noble, some necessary, some pungent. Gone farmers. After dark, crews descended into cesspits to shovel night soil into barrels. Town statutes set routes and disposal points. Pay was solid. Social status low. Fires, fumes, and collapse made it dangerous work. But without them, streets and cellars would choke. Tanners and fullers. Tanners soaked hides in urine and lime before curing them with bark. Streams near tanneries ran foul. Fullers stomped newly woven woolen vats to thicken cloth, filling mills later mechanized the pounding. The smell offended. The output clothed Europe. Leech collectors and barbers. Marsh women gathered leeches off their legs for physicians' bleeding bowls. Barber surgeons shaved beards, pulled teeth, lanced boils, and set bones under the red and white pole. Astrology might set auspicious times, uroscopy examining your unguided diagnosis. Saltpeter men and lime burners. Gunpowder's rise created saltpeter scavengers who scraped bone. Walls and cellars for nitrate-rich efflorescence. Then leached and boiled it. Lime burners tended roaring kilns that turned chalk into quicklime for. Mortar and agriculture. Executioners and criers. The executioner occupied a paradox, official, well-paid and shunned. Towns built his house at the edge. His skills precise, even merciful in speed, were grimly respected. The town crier did the opposite, center stage, bell ringing. Voice carrying statutes and market prices across the square, entertainers and specialists. Beerwards led chained bears for baiting. Minstrels performed epics. Tooth drawers offered miraculous extractions. Quacks sold panaceas. Scribes hired out careful hands. Bell founders poured molten bronze into giant molds and gave a town its voice. Later folklore remembers sin eaters, a paid ritual to eat bread over a corpse and absorb sins, the medieval roots of murkia. What we do see clearly are soul cakes and funerary feasts, where food and alms connected the living and the dead. Every odd trade made the ordinary possible. Clean streets, watertight roofs, serviceable shoes, edible beer, and bearable teeth. Animals were co-workers, currency, and companions. Law, art, and daily life were crowded with them. Livestock economy. Oxen pulled plows through heavy soils. Horses destriers for war. Palfreys for riding. Cart horses for haulage multiplied speed, but cost more to keep. Sheep were walking looms. English fleeces underwrote fortunes. Pigs foraged in woods. Autumn pannage turned acorns into bacon. Geese guarded yards. Ducks fattened on ponds. Bees sweetened and preserved. Dogs and cats. Hounds coursed through tapestries. Greyhounds and brachets chased stags in aristocratic haunts. Peasant dogs guarded doors and herded geese. Cats haunted granaries. Adored for rodent control and sometimes maligned in anxious sermons. Folk killed kittens and named mouses in wills. Falconry, a language of status with wings. Falcons for Empress Seca. Peregrine. Hawks for lesser ranks. Treatises taught hooding, manning, and the subtle reading of a bird's temper. Frederick II's De Arte Venonde Commovibus is both manual and meditation science in feathers. Exotic menageries. Courts collected wonder. Henry III kept lions at the Tower of London. A polar bear supposedly fished the Thames on a leash in the 1250s. Monkeys jittered in noble halls. Cranes paced lawns, animals in law and symbol. Bestiaries made morals from beasts, the pelican. Reviving chicks becomes Christ. The industrious ant, a parable of prudence. Law fined pig owners for trampling gardens. Villages posted swineherds to keep order. Some courts even staged animal trials. reflecting a worldview where the line between human and beast was moral as much as biological. Medieval people lived in a soundscape of animals, the creak of harness, hiss of geese, rumble of hooves, cluck, and bleat at dusk, and loved and relied on them in ways at once practical and tender. The cliché of the filthy medieval misses a more complicated picture of habit, infrastructure, and belief. Washing and bathhouses, households kept hand basins, pitchers, and towels. Etiquette books, snag readers to wash before meals. Towns maintained public bathhouses, steam rooms, tubs, sometimes mixed sex and later morally suspect, herbs, rosemary, mint-scented water, during plague years. Worry about open pores reduced bathing in some places. Teeth, hair, and clothing, instructions survived for tooth powders of salt, ashes, mint. Linen cloths rubbed gums, combs often bone-chased lice, hair was oiled and braided. Linen undergarments, changed and boiled, helped keep skin clean beneath rarely washed outer wool. Water and waste. Cities invested in conduits, gravity-fed pipes from springs to public fountains. London's great. Conduit in the 13th century supplied Cheapside. Privies ranged from bits to garderoobs over. Streams, guilds enforced sweeping and refused carting, with mixed results. Hospitals and care. Hospitals, often monastic, gave food, bed, prayer, and basic nursing. The for humour theory guided physicians. Barber surgeons bled patients, set bones, and lanced boils. Astrology set auspicious days. Uroscopy peered into urine flasks for balance. Regimens and remedies. The popular regimen of health from Salerno recommended balanced diet. Moderate wine, clean air, and regular evacuations. Advice as much wellness as medicine of sage. Fennel, yarrow. Willow bark had genuine effects among charms and nonsense. Myths and the plague, remedies in. Crises grew desperate. Aromatic posies against miasma. Amulets, crushed gems, onions on buboes. Flagellants whipped themselves in public penitence. Doctors donned bird-beaked masks centuries later in early modern iconography. The boundary between piety and placebo was porous, but care, community, and convalescence still mattered. Medieval hygiene wasn't us. But it wasn't indifference. It was an ethic of order, habits, sense, schedules shaped by theology and the limits of contemporary science. The medieval millennium ebbed not with a single battle, but with accelerations of text, travel, and technology that reconfigured Europe. Movable type in the 1450s. Johannes Gutenberg's press married metal type, all basics, and a sturdy screw press. A scribe might copy a book in months. A shop of printers could set and pull hundreds of pages a day. The Gutenberg Bible announced a new texture of words: regular, abundant, portable. Print shops and publics, cities like Mainz, Nuremberg, Venice, and Paris grew printing neighborhoods. Printers were entrepreneurs, censors, editors, and marketers. William Caxton set up England's first press in Westminster 1470s, translating and standardizing as he sold. Broadsheets and pamphlets multiplied. The Nuremberg Chronicle 1493 stitched universal history to woodcut cities and monsters, ideas. Travel faster. Universities and merchants already formed networks. Now books outpaced them. Humanist scholarship recovering Greek and Latin classics could circulate widely. Devotional movements printed primers and meditations. Legal and medical handbooks became affordable tools. Not heirlooms, gunpowder and states. Cannon reshaped castles and war. Artillery trains demanded taxation and bureaucracy. Kings centralized, parliaments matured, and mercenary companies professionalized. Armor peaked in artistry even as bullets made it obsolete. Edges of the map. The fall of Constantinople 1453 shocked Christendom and redirected trade. Refugee scholars brought Greek texts west. Dyers rounded the Cape 1488. Columbus crossed the Atlantic 1492. Pepperroots bent. Imagination bent with them, repercussion. In 1517, just outside our medieval frame, Luther's theses flashed through presses and postal roads. The explosion only underscores the change already underway. A Europe where words scale, where authority must answer print with more than pulpits. The Middle Ages thin out into early. Modernity as letters quicken, powers consolidate, and the world grows larger and closer at once. When we close our eyes and picture the Middle Ages, it is tempting to think of them as a self-contained box in time. An era of castles, knights, and monks separated from the modern world by the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. But history doesn't work in neat compartments. The truth is that the Middle Ages never fully ended. They bled forward, their institutions, beliefs, and inventions woven into the very fabric of our modern lives. So what is the legacy of the Middle Ages? To answer that, we need to look at the enduring structures of thought, culture, and daily life that the medieval world left behind, structures we still inhabit today. The Middle Ages gave birth to the university. Bologna, Paris, Oxford. These names are still among the most famous institutions of higher learning. Their DNA runs through every modern college classroom. Students in the 13th century gathered in drafty halls to hear a master's lecture on Aristotle, medicine, law, or theology. Degrees were conferred after years of disputations and examinations. Sound familiar? Our bachelors, masters, and doctoral systems trace directly back to this medieval invention. At Oxford in the 14th century, students weren't just scholars, they were troublemakers. Records tell of town and gown riots between students and locals, often sparked by unpaid tavern bills. Yet through these conflicts, the structure of a permanent scholarly community was established, one that survives today. The Middle Ages also laid the groundwork for national languages and literatures before then. Latin was the language of the educated elite, but Dante's Divine Comedy in Italian, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in English, and troubadour poetry in French and Occitan gave shape to modern tongues. When you read a novel in your own language, you're living in the shadow of medieval writers who first elevated the vernacular. One scribe, perhaps bored, doodled in the margins of a manuscript, drawing a little knight fighting a snail. These doodles appear in manuscripts all over Europe. What did they mean? Some scholars suggest they mocked futility or symbolized sin. Others think scribes just had fun. Whatever the case, they remind us that the human side of intellectual life, jokes, creativity, individuality, was alive even in austere libraries. One of the most enduring medieval legacies is the idea that law can limit power. The Magna Carta, sealed by King John of England in 1215, was no democratic revolution, but it planted a principle that even kings were subject to law. Over centuries, this seed grew into constitutional government. Municipal charters granted towns the right to self-govern, elect councils, and regulate markets. This was the slow birth of civic democracy. Guilds enforced fair trade. Courts of merchants settled disputes. Parliaments and estates began advising rulers in 13th century York. Bakers were fined for selling loaves underweight. To avoid punishment, bakers began throwing in an extra rule when selling by the dozen. That's where we get the phrase a baker's dozen, a little piece of medieval regulation that still lingers in language today. Juries, contracts, property rights. These legal frameworks matured in the medieval world and still structure our societies. When you sign a lease, attend jury duty, or vote in a parliament, you're participating in a legacy that traces back to the Middle Ages. The rhythms of medieval festivals still punctuate our calendars. Christmas, Easter, and even Valentine's Day carry medieval traditions forward. Carnival, with its masks and reversals of social order, remains a staple in Europe and South America. May Day's flowers, midsummer bonfires, and harvest festivals survive in altered form around the world. And then there's folklore. King Arthur still appears in novels and films. Robin Hood lives on in Disney animations and Hollywood epics. Medieval fairy lore and witch tales seeped into Shakespeare's plays and through him into English literature at large. In 1590, Shakespeare's Henry VI plays dramatized events from a century earlier, borrowing freely from medieval chronicles. His audience, Elizabethans, still thought of themselves as heirs to the medieval past. And we, in turn, still consume those stories. Even our love of fantasy, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Dungeons and Dragons, is steeped in medievalism. Castles, swords, knights, dragons, and quests. The imagery of our popular culture is medieval at its core. It's easy to dismiss the Middle Ages as stagnant. But many technologies that reshaped the world came from this period. Eyeglasses, invented in 13th century Italy, extended lifespans of learning and craftsmanship. Mechanical clocks began appearing on town towers, regulating urban life. Time became standardized. Windmills and water mills transformed agriculture, grinding grain, pumping water, fulling cloth. The stirrup revolutionized cavalry. The compass enabled long-distance navigation. A 14th century mill in England operated continuously, in one form or another, for over 600 years. That's medieval engineering echoing into the modern era. Scientific thought advanced through universities and scholars like Roger Bacon, who studied optics, and Albertus Magnus, who wrote on natural philosophy. They worked within theological frameworks, yes, but they laid foundations for the later scientific revolution. The medieval world was the cradle of capitalism. Guilds regulated production, training apprentices into masters. They set prices, maintained standards, and organized communities. Modern trade unions and professional associations descend from this tradition. Banking families like the Medici pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, loans, and credit systems. Fairs in Champagne connected Italian merchants with northern traders. The Hanseatic League knit together a trading network across the Baltic and North Seas. Markets, contracts, currencies. These innovations fueled commerce that grew into global trade. When you tap a card or wire money, you're participating in systems whose ancestors were medieval. Perhaps nothing speaks more visibly to the medieval legacy than architecture. Cathedrals like Chartres, Cologne, and Notre Dame still stand. Their flying buttresses, pointed arches, and stained glass changed skylines forever. Town halls, bridges, and castles built in the Middle Ages still define landscapes across Europe. The bells of Notre Dame rang through coronations, revolutions, and wars. They rang in the 13th century, and they still ring today, a living voice of the medieval past. Our fascination with the Gothic revival in the 19th century, from parliament buildings to university campuses, shows how deeply medieval aesthetics resonate. Even modern fantasy art borrows Gothic spires and vaulted arches. And finally, beyond institutions and technologies, the greatest legacy is human. The resilience of peasants, the hidden labor of women, the patience of monks, the daring of merchants, the imagination of poets. These shaped Europe as much as kings and battles did. Their fears, famine, disease, war, remain familiar. Their hopes, love, prosperity, justice, remain ours. A medieval chronicler once wrote, "Men think times are worse than before, Yet every age has its burdens. That voice could belong to someone today. So when we ask, what is the legacy of the Middle Ages? The answer is simple. We are living in it. Our universities, parliaments, festivals, markets, cathedrals, even our stories of heroes and monsters, all carry medieval fingerprints. The Middle Ages are not gone. They are in our laws, our architecture, our literature, our calendars, our economies, our imaginations. To dismiss them as dark is to ignore that they are the foundation beneath our feet. And that brings us to one final reflection. And so, after walking through nearly 1,000 years of history, we arrive at the end of our journey. But before we step away from the Middle Ages, let's pause, breathe, and look back at what this age truly meant, not just in battles and kings, but in the lives of millions of ordinary people. The Middle Ages were a paradox. They were an age of faith and doubt, of starvation and feasting, of harsh labor and quiet joy. They were full of contradictions, knights who swore chivalry yet slaughtered peasants, priests who preached humility yet built cathedrals to scrape the heavens, villagers who feared witches but also trusted herbalists to heal them. Think back to the peasant family. Their world was tiny, bounded by fields, forests, and the village church. Yet their labor fed kingdoms. Did they think of themselves as medieval? No. They thought of themselves as simply alive, praying for good harvests, fearing a poor winter, and hoping their children survived. Their names rarely made it into chronicles, but without them, there is no history. And the nobles, with their castles and courts. They seemed powerful, yet how often did we see them scrambling for wealth, alliance, or survival? A knight in armor glittered in tournaments, but could be unseated by a humble longbowman. Power was precarious, even at the top. The monks and nuns, rising in the dark to pray. In their silence, they copied texts that would shape Europe for centuries. Think of the patients, quill-scratching parchment, candle burning low, hands cramping. Some complained in the margins, "It is cold, the parchment is rough. May God grant me ale." Without their boring work, much of ancient learning would have vanished forever. And then, the plaguers, imagine carts rolling through narrow streets, bells tolling as priests rushed last rites, families vanishing overnight. Fear gripped every corner of Europe. And yet, some survived, rebuilt, and carried on. Out of loss came change. Wages rose. Feudal bonds weakened, and society shifted. Now consider folklore, legends of Arthur, Robin Hood. Werewolves and fairies weren't just entertainment. They were reflections of hope, justice, and fear. When life was hard, stories made sense of it. They told peasants that outlaws could be heroes, that kings could return, that monsters explained the dark. And don't we do the same today, with superheroes, myths, and urban legends? A 14th century Englishman wrote, "Times are always hard, yet men always endure." That could have been written yesterday. When we step back, the Middle Ages stop being dark or romantic. They become profoundly human. We see people struggling, laughing, working, praying, feasting, fearing, and hoping. People not so different from us. So what does this leave us with? A reminder that history isn't just rulers. It's ordinary lives. A realization that hardship and resilience are timeless. An invitation to reflect on our own age, 1,000 years from now. What will they say about us? And here's where I want you, the viewer, to join me. Drop a comment with what fascinated you most about medieval life. Would you choose to live as a peasant, a noble, or a monk for one day? And don't you forget to share your favorite period of history. I am always curious which eras call to you most. Finally, If you've enjoyed this long walk through history, please like this video, subscribe to One Boring Historian, and share it with fellow history lovers. Your support helps bring more boringly accurate deep dives to life. And remember, history is never just the story of the past. It's the mirror in which we see ourselves now. Let's close the book on the Middle Ages, but keep its lessons alive in our own time. And that brings us to the end of our journey through the Middle Ages, from the quiet prayer of monks to the clash of knights, from bustling markets to village hearts. We've walked through 1,000 years of history together. If you've enjoyed this deep dive, do me a favor, give this video a like, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next chapter in our long, boringly accurate tour through history. Here at One Boring Historian, we don't make things flashy. We make them clear. History doesn't have to be confusing, just honest, detailed, and sometimes a little boring in the best way. Thanks for spending your time here, and until next time, keep your curiosity alive, and remember, stay boring.